Today, we are going to do a little introduction to research data management topics. These slides were originally developed by the Research Data Working Group from the Leibniz Association, but I've adjusted them to this session. They are open source and available to be used by anyone again. In my job, I do a mix of research data management and general data management. And today we'll go into the research topic specifically. The objectives for today are that we will do an introduction to the research data management fundamentals, which will give you guidance through the research project and research output lifecycle. We're going to do basically a very small introduction to all kinds of research data management topics. All of them could be their own lecture probably. And I think some of them will be covered a bit more in depth by other people this week. This will just be very much an introduction to get to know different topics that you can consider in research data. And the things we talk about throughout today don't specifically have to apply to research data, but it could be any project data that you're working with. They're all just kind of things to keep in mind when you're working with data in general. What is data and metadata? Just so we're all on the same page. The data is the soup cans. We have the soup in the cans, but we don't know anything about it. The metadata is where we add all the information about what's in the can. So we want to know what's in the soup, when it was made, what kind of soup it is. That's our metadata. And we put them together and we have our data and metadata. The metadata represents all the information that adds context and meaning to research data in a structured way. Research data is any digital data that is used in, created by, or resulting from research. It could be raw data that you collect in the field, simulation data, observation data. It could come from code, algorithms, scripts. It could be audio-visual data. It's basically just any data you create or use for research. And then the metadata is the data about the data. So who created the data set? What is the data set about? How was the data set collected? What does it include? How can it be used? Where did it come from? All of those kind of questions. I forgot to say, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat throughout the session, and we can answer them at the end. Save them for the end as well, if you like. So why do we have research data management? Basically, we need to organize our data. We would like to have a smooth process of collecting our research data and then ending up with our research output. However, in reality, that's usually a bit of a mess. We often go back and forwards and lose things and gain things and forget what we've done or something like that. If we include research data management, we can hopefully have a straightforward process of reaching our end goal of our research. So what is research data management? It concerns the organization of data from its entry to the research cycle through to the dissemination and archiving of the results. When should we usually start thinking about data in the process? Right at the very start, we should be thinking about the data. In the project proposal phase, we should definitely be thinking about the data. Often when you propose a project, there is a funder's requirement to have research data management plans or ideas listed. And so you want to be thinking about it right from the start. And this kind of research data management or project proposal plan should be a tool to help you and the team through the project's research data management. You want to incorporate it from the start of your project for your benefit, as well as for any funders who you're looking to get help from for the project. The proposal phase. In Germany, a lot of funding comes from the DFG, and the DFG has a checklist of how you should handle research data. They have these requirements of what you should include in your project proposal, and that includes a plan of defining how the data will be created, how it will be documented, who will access it, where will it be stored, and so on. You can see on the right, they have the DFG checklist. Those are the fields you have to cover, things like a description of the data, Where does the data even come from? The documentation and the quality of the data. How will you ensure the data quality throughout the project? What digital methods will you use? Storage and technical archiving of the project. So how will you store the data during the project and then after the project's finished? Are there legal obligations and conditions that you have to follow with your data? When one thing to consider is copyright law. And then when you're exchanging data and looking at long-term data accessibility, for example, which data sets are useful for other contexts and how will you archive your data in a suitable way? And then the responsibilities and resources, who in your project will actually handle this data and how will they do that? This is just an idea of initial questions you might be asked about the data. And if you're not, you should be maybe starting to think about them at the start of a project regardless. To create a data management plan for these kind of projects, there are a lot of different online tools that can talk you through all of these questions. One great example is the GF Bio Data Management Plan. That's a natural history specific plan for how you're going to store your research data. But if that doesn't quite fit to what your project's about, there are lots of other generic tools like DMP tool or Easy DMP. I think something that's quite nice is just to go through if your funding body doesn't need a specific plan. I quite like going through some different plans and getting ideas of the different questions they ask and putting those together to create your own plan. I think it's quite helpful too. Your institution might also have a specific plan they recommend as well. Some examples of data management plan are everywhere online. You can Google them and find examples of plans. There are some links here. Now we get to the RDM/project/output lifecycle. So this is what we're going to go through today to have a look at our whole research data management throughout the whole process of a project. This research data management lifecycle follows 4 steps. So there's design and planning of the process, collecting and creating data, processing and analysis, and sharing and reuse. And within each step, there are a lot of other small steps, and we'll have a look at some of those now as we go through. As I said, this is just a little introduction to all the parts, and we can go through a lot more detail of all of them as well. We'll start by looking at the planning phase, design and planning, which goes into project planning, policies, coaching, resource planning, storage backup, data organization. This is basically the start of the project. One thing to look at here is policy requirements. We want to consider any relevant policies when we're planning our project. For example, open science and fair data principles, which I think you have sessions on this week, good scientific practice policies, any funder requirements, any policies from your institution. Your institution might have a copyright policy, a data management policy. I know at the MFN we have 100 different policies for everything. This is the time you want to go through and just get a rough idea of what policies you should be looking at to make sure your data process will be smooth throughout the entire research cycle. The FAIR data principles are for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. Findable data is so that people can find the data, obviously, once it's published. Accessible, they can download the object and use it. Interoperable, they can open the object. Reusable, and they can use it. And it should be as fair as possible for humans and machines to find and use the data. That's our goal when publishing data, is to follow these FAIR principles to enhance the value and future of your research, which we'll talk more about later. Another step in design and planning is looking for coaching and guidance. You can ask your institution's local data manager or data steward or library team or computing center. They're hiding in a lot of different places, usually, people with knowledge on these topics. but you should be able to get information on policies, guidelines, tools, training, things like that through these people in your institutions. And if not, you can always reach out to the WiNoDa team. They also can help offer these services if you don't have anything in your institution to help with that. Now we'll have a quick look at storage and backup. Has anyone ever done a research project and partway through lost some of their data? If not, that's wonderful, but it might happen one day. So we want to follow the 3-2-1 storage and backup plan, which is the best practice for ensuring that you don't lose data. What this involves is having 3 copies of your data saved on 2 different types of media, and one should be in a different location. For example, you'd have 3 copies of your data. 2 might be on your laptop, 1 might be on a hard drive, and then you might have 1 on a cloud, so it's not stored physically with your laptop and your hard drive next to each other, and then something happens to those. So this is a way to prevent data loss, just storing your data consistently throughout the process in different locations so that you don't wake up one day with all your data gone. Hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone, but this is a technique to prevent that. What is data storage? You may also hear the words archive, repository, publication thrown around as well. So backing up your data is how you're storing it. Storing your data is when you're actively using your data and it's just for you to access. It's short-term storage. You might have it on your computer, maybe on a cloud, but in a few different places that just you can access as you're working on it. And then archive data is going to be data that you can't access all the time. It's not published, but you can access it when you need to. It will be stored long-term and preserved, and there are usually specific archive services for your institution who can help with that. Published data is when you put it out into the open for anyone in the public to use. It involves, long-term storing the data again, but also having people be able to access this long-term data storage. And how are we going to save our files? I know I am a victim to some of the examples on the left: final document, last document, publish this document, no publish this document actually. I would guess that I'm not the only one here who does that sometimes, but there are better ways to do it than that. And sometimes I still have to remind myself that even if I think it's the last document, it's not going to be. And I should probably name my files properly. So we have some examples of better naming conventions here. You can do things like put the date in, and then a descriptive title, and then a version number. Number 1, a version number, a descriptive title, a specific, for a JPEG, a specific figure number, and then it actually explaining what the file is so you can find it again. This is also something that should go into your project planning. Maybe set up a little template for yourself at the start on how you want to name your documents throughout the process so you can find them easily. We'll move on to the data collection phase. The next phase is collect and create. Data retrieval, sensitive data, metadata. The project is planned and the funding's been acquired, and now we're starting more into the actual project. What is data collection? Data collection is obtaining raw or new data through experiments, interviews, focus groups, observations. It could be field research, things like that. So it's just brand new data that you're creating for this project. Whereas data retrieval is identifying and analyzing existing data sets to make them usable for your own research questions. So someone else has created the data in the past, but you're reusing it, maybe changing it to create new versions of it, but it already existed in some form before. There are a few ways to search for data, to retrieve data for your projects. You can search through metadata search engines such as DataCite. There are also subject-specific research repositories. I'll give you some examples of those later, but Re3 data is basically it's a website which has all kinds of different data repositories for different fields listed. You can go through those and find something that might be relevant to what you're looking for. WiNoDa is a generic data repository that you can search for relevant data. And another way to look for relevant data for you is to go through citations of publications on similar topics that you're looking for. People should cite their research data there. Maybe it's data that can be reused for something you're doing too, depending on the licensing. So that's how we can find data for our projects. And then what data types and file formats are there? So we would encourage you to choose open data types to increase the accessibility, reuse, and sharing of your data set. So what are open file formats? They're openly documented and widely supported file types. For example, we'd recommend using a CSV over an Excel format because Excel formats you need Microsoft Excel to be able to use, so they're not open. Same with some of the other formats, like an Adobe Illustrator file requires people to have Adobe Illustrator, so it's not as open as some other formats like a PNG or something. So you want to choose open data types where you can when you're creating data. We'll have a quick look at documentation and metadata. When you're doing a project, you should document what's going on. It will help you as well as others. You want to have documentation about the project and then documentation about the data for the project. Of course, you want the metadata, which we already talked about, is information about the data specifically. So we should capture the metadata during data generation and then choose appropriate documentation methods. Use standardized terms and IDs and follow provenance tracking. Another problem that I know I've had with data is that I will work on something, maybe make some changes to some data sets, do some transformation, and then put it down for a few weeks and come back and forget what I did to it. If we document what we do at the time to the data, we can avoid problems like that. So how do we document metadata? There are a lot of different metadata standards that we can use. Metadata standards allow a structured description of data by using specific metadata elements. There are all different types of metadata structures specific to any different field within natural history. There are a few like Darwin Core, integrated taxonomic information systems. There's ecological metadata language. There are different geographic standards. Every field has so many metadata standards. So you need to find which one's going to suit your data. And there is a link to a metadata standards catalog that can help you with that. So one discipline-specific metadata standard is Darwin Core. And this is part of the biodiversity information standards. This is also known as TEDWG. So these are many standards maintained by the natural history community. And Darwin Core is a meta format for natural history, specimen, and occurrence data. It's a list of terms, and basically it's a way to display species data in a standardized format. So I'd recommend maybe having a look into TEDWG and the different kinds of formats they offer, the different kinds of standards they offer for different things. For example, they also have an audiovisual data standard. They have lots of standards for our areas. Another metadata standard is Pangea. This is Pangea's composite model. Pangea publishes earth and environmental science data. You can maybe see if you squint really hard the different fields that they cover. Metadata they would ask for here is like an abstract, keywords about the project, the source of the project, the references, and then on the right you can see some fields that they require. like who is the PI of the project, the author of the dataset title, things like that. So that's just an example of what kind of things a metadata standard might ask you for. But like I said, they're all different and there are so many to suit any types of data. And this is definitely something that you could ask for help from your local data steward or the WiNoDa team or someone around you who's worked with them before might be able to help point you in the right direction of what exactly you should use for your project. Now we'll have a little look at persistent identifiers. So these are a few different examples. There's Wikidata and some norm data, that's a German one, I guess, and then geonames. So what that looks like is in geonames, this example here, I've pulled up Berlin. And then on the right, there's this identifier 2950159. And that is showing directly pointing us to the city of Berlin. It's important to use an identifier because if you just write Berlin, we might not know if you're talking about Berlin, Germany, or Berlin, I think there's one in Connecticut or something in the USA. So there's two Berlins. We want to know which one we're referring to. So sometimes you need a little bit more information and a stable way to trace back what you're actually studying and researching. So GeoNames is a tool to find any kind of places and reference those. Next, we're having a look at the processing and analysis phase. This will go through data quality and processing the data as it says. There are different stages of data. We start with raw data, which is the data that's originally generated by a system or device. It hasn't been processed, you haven't transformed it, done anything with it yet. It's really at the data creation phase or when something's first digitized. And then we move into the active data, which are data sets, documents, and scripts at various stages of development. They're usually not published or released, but they're the data that you're actively working on. And then we have analysis ready data. So that is after multiple iterations pre-processing, you review the data, and then you have done enough that it becomes ready for analysis. So it's data with a sufficient maturity level and could be publishable. We'll also have a quick look at if you're coding. So you can use the same ideas that we talked about for coding data, for software, for data sets like that. You want to make sure you can understand and reuse your code. So that goes back to the documentation steps. And you want to use versioning. So versioning, every time you change something, you create either a new minor version or a major version of the data of the code, basically. I am not a coding expert by any means. I don't do much coding at all. So maybe someone else could tell you more about this, but just something to keep in mind. If you are coding, there are also best practices you can use, and there is a link to some here. And then we have data provenance, which is tracking the origin of the information. Where did the data come from and where is it going? What transformations are we doing to the data? Are we using unique identifiers to keep track of where the data, what the data is, where it is? Then, of course, we want to quality control our data, which is process monitoring, detecting for errors, and doing random checks to ensure your data fulfills everything you need it to. For example, explicit and consistent variable naming and checking file exports for errors, making sure that your data, even basics, the file will still open when you're ready to publish it, as well as the specifics of maybe following a controlled vocabulary if you're using a metadata format. There are so many ways to quality control data, and that can definitely be its own session. I'm not sure if you have one specifically, but that's a whole other topic, but something to keep in mind here as well. And now we're already on the last phase, which is sharing and reuse of data. So why should we share our data? There are benefits for you, including citations. If you share your data, other people can use it, they can cite your data, you'll get recognition, maybe some collaborations by others who have similar research topics, and hopefully it can grow your career. There are also benefits to the public. There's opportunities for citizen science, there's validation of your research, and there are benefits to the research community. For example, it makes it easier for people to find useful resources. For example, if maybe you use someone else's data at the start, maybe someone could benefit from using yours later for something else. It makes research more efficient if more data is published, and you enable new research to be made. I think in natural science, especially, we want to encourage data reuse. I think everyone's involved in this field for the right reasons and really has a bit of a focus on conservation and kind of, yeah, maintaining, I don't know, maintaining the planet in general. And I think sharing our data and kind of research data enables others to gain more information about this so we can all use this data together to benefit the earth in the most basic way. But yeah, there are many other benefits to sharing data as well. But how do you share data? Your data could also be restricted, so people could only use it under certain conditions, or it could be closed where you don't allow access to other people. You want to keep your data as open as possible and only as closed as necessary. There are some reasons you might not want to have it open. For example, in natural history, sometimes we face the problem of endangered species, and often like collection data or observation data can share the locations of endangered species, and we don't want to publish those for anyone to be able to hunt down endangered species, obviously. So that is like one reason you might want to keep something more private. But in general, we want to support open data as open as possible. So what is intellectual property? That's a creation of the mind. It's the work that you create. And then we have the intellectual property, which is the legal tool to protect your IP. So things like a copyright or a trademark license. But we commonly use Creative Commons licenses when publishing data. So there are, I don't know how many, 6, 7 Creative Commons licenses. So the first one is public domain. That's not actually a license. That's like more means it doesn't have any license. So the data is completely open for anyone to use. You don't have to reference anyone. The kind of lowest level of license is CC BY, where the author has to be attributed. So you have to reference the person who created it, but you can do anything to the data. You can modify it, use it commercially. And then there are different combinations of if you can modify the data, use it commercially, and if you have to share it with the same license or not. So if you're picking a license for your data, I would recommend searching like a Creative Commons license picker. You can Google that and then figure out what license will best be suited for your data. And that's an easy way to license your data and make it quite open when you want to share it. And then you can share your data in data journals. There's a link to a list of data journals here as well, but there are various data journals, of course, which you can publish your data in. Things like the Earth System Science Data, Biodiversity Data Journal, Geoscience Data Journal. There's many which you can find something that suits your data, or talk to your institution about that and publish your data to make it more accessible and usable by other researchers. And then we'll have a quick look at persistent identifiers for data publication. Persistent identifiers for organizations. A commonly used one is an ROR. So all different institutions will have an ROR, like you can see these like ROR slash basically lots of numbers and letters. But this will be like the stable link to an institution. Even if the institution's name changes a little bit throughout the years, you'll still be able to find the right one if you have this kind of linked in your data or your metadata. You can also create an ORCID. So ORCIDs are IDs for researchers. Some of my colleagues' examples are here, and you should create your own if you're publishing any kind of data or research or papers so that everything can be linked back to you. I know there are quite a few Caitlin Thorns in the world, having Googled myself before. And so this makes sure that anything I publish is linked back to me specifically. You can also get a DOI for research and other outputs. So a DOI is a stable digital object identifier, but you can publish many things with one. For example, your data set or posters from a conference, your other publications you create, you can give them a DOI so that they always have a stable link to come back to. If you're writing a research paper, it is a great idea to get a DOI for your data. So what you would do is you would, for example, submit an article to a journal, but you want to reference your data within that article. So you'd want to get a DOI for your data first, and then you can reference yourself in the article. So a DOI allows you to publish your data set and reference it in an appendix, and it will index your data so others can view it and use it. And again, you can talk to your local data manager or data steward or library team on how to get a DOI. Most institutions will be familiar with this and will have their own repository. If that's not working, you can publish it yourself on somewhere like WiNoDa, or you can reach out to myself or the WiNoDa team. We can maybe help you find an appropriate place to publish it. But how do you find the right repository to publish your data on? Like I mentioned earlier, there's Re3Data, which is the registry of research data repositories. You can browse every kind of research subject that exists to find an appropriate one. You can browse by country. For example, some countries might just have a repository for any kind of research that goes on there. And then on the right, you can see just an example again for Pangea. And so you can look through these and find what would be relevant for your data set. And yeah, so if you can request to publish your data through one of those repositories. If you publish through a repository, a subject-specific repository, it will also enhance the visibility of your data. I'm not sure if maybe you ever browse repositories yourselves, but of course some researchers do when they're looking for data, browse through these relevant repositories to find data that could be of interest to them. And here are some more examples of repositories. So there are general repositories, like I mentioned, WiNoDa, there's Figshare, Dryad, and then there are subject-specific repositories, things like GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, very big natural science collection. I would definitely recommend publishing species data and observation data through them. There's Pangea again, the European Nucleotide Archive, if that's data you're working with. And then lots of institutions have their own repositories as well. There's a couple of examples here, like the Technical University of Dresden has their own repository. So if you happen to be there, you could publish there. But there's so many others, your institution might have its own anyway. So you can talk to them about publishing your data. You can also publish it in multiple places. So you might publish it to your institutional repository and to GBIF just to have it open and, I don't know, findable by more people. And then how do we publish our FAIR code? You want to publish your code to maybe GitHub or GitLab, and then you can also publish it to WiNoDa to ensure long-term archiving. You can also create new versions with WiNoDa every time you release a new thing on GitHub. Like I said, I'm definitely no coding expert, but there is a link here with more information about that. And just something you might want to keep in mind is publishing your code either alongside or separate to the data publication. So how do we put everything together? Well, this is an example of our data flows at the Museum for Naturkunde. It's a very broad, generic example, but we start with our existing data sources, such as our digitization projects or collection objects. We also have new data from the field or research, and then we do some data management. So, data cleaning, data enrichment, quality control, and transformation. It then moves to data storage, which we break down into data types. So, we have repositories for example, our sound data goes to the Animal Sound Archive. We have library data, and of course, we have collection data in Specify. We then have publish our data internally in our digital catalog, which we're developing still. And then from there, we can publish externally to places like GeoEarth, GFBio, etc. And we can always reuse data, add annotations, and things like that. So that's just one kind of very generic example of our data process at the museum. And I think that's all I have for you here. So hopefully that gave you something to maybe come back to later.